It's my honour to welcome everyone here this morning to a seminar by Professor Chadwick, Chickasaw man. He's Associate Vice-Provost for the Faculty Advancement at the University of Washington, and between 2013 and 2014 served as the President of the Native American Indigenous Studies Association, or NAISA. Professor Allen is currently in Australia to provide a keynote address to this week's 2015 NIRAKN and NATSIHEC International Indigenous Research Conference in Adelaide. So as soon as he finishes here, he'll be on the plane off to Adelaide. So Professor Allen received his Ph.D. in comparative cultural and literary studies from the University of Arizona, a master's degree in writing from Washington University, and a bachelor's degree from Harvard University. He's a recipient of 2 Fulbright scholarships to Aotearoa, New Zealand, where he studied Maori literature and culture at Auckland University. So his seminar today is entitled Earthworks, Representation and Research, Situating Indigenous Methodologies. Please welcome Professor Allen.
Well, thank you all for coming out. I know there's a lot of else going on, and I appreciate the welcome and to be here. Last time I was in Darwin was in 1988 during the Australian Bicentennial, and it has changed a little bit since I was here last.
Sorry, Chad, I might just say that just acknowledge the university is located on Larrakia land, traditional owners, and pay our respects.
Yes, I appreciate that. Yes, and I was going to say it's interesting to be here to see. I've been walking around Darwin the last couple of days and noticing some of the signage and stuff, but there is some acknowledgement locally of the traditional owners. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about earthworks and earthworks as they intersect with literature and art, and also what's happening in contemporary Native communities. Some research I've been doing for a number of years, and it intersects very much, I think, with the idea of how do we bring Indigenous methodologies into the dominant academic space? How do we bring Indigenous methodologies into the academy? And I'm interested particularly in thinking about what do Indigenous methodologies look like specifically in arts and humanities research, since so much of the work has been done really in the social sciences and in education, and thinking about what Indigenous methodologies might look like. And I'm interested in what kinds of particular knowledges and understandings Indigenous methodologies might produce, again, specifically within arts and literature areas of study. I said I had 2 articles, and if people want to read those at some point, what I'm going to do today is review sort of some of the main areas of the research I've been doing, the way earthworks have come into contemporary literature and art and community, and then there'll be time for some discussion, and if we have some time, I also sent ahead some poems by a native poet, Alyssa Hinton, who's done some remarkable work with building earthworks poetry, and if we have time, we could also talk about some of those. I should say that I lived in Ohio for the last 17 years. I've just recently moved to the University of Washington. And because I believe very much that an Indigenous studies approach, you always have to think about the local, wherever you happen to be. Where are you? What's the history of this place? And how might the history of this place affect the research we do across any discipline? And so when I moved to Ohio, I was trying to think about how do I bring Ohio's Indigenous history into my classroom. And Ohio is one of the major areas for mound building cultures, from between 2,000 and 500 years ago. And so I started thinking about earthworks. It then turned out, and of course this is what often happens, when you think about the local where you are, it often brings you back around to your own local. As Steve mentioned, I have Chickasaw ancestry. The Chickasaw originally from the southeastern part of what's now the United States, sort of Alabama and southern Tennessee. But in the 1830s, we removed Oklahoma, so my family's from Oklahoma. But the Chickasaw were also mound-building people, and throughout the Southeast, also mound-building cultures, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, all mound-building peoples up until the 1500s were active mound-building. And actually, it turns out, some groups, the Creek in particular, never stopped building earthworks, just on a smaller scale after removal. So it's another thing I'm interested in thinking about how Indigenous studies methodologies often bring us to surprising places we weren't necessarily expecting. So across my presentation, I want you to listen for a couple of things. I want you to notice the kind of movement. I'm going to start out by talking about earthworks in more kind of conventional ways, thinking about it as a literary topic or theme that shows up in certain literature and artworks. Then I'm going to be moving toward thinking about earthworks as structure and form, certain artists and writers who are really looking at earthworks principles and bringing into their work. And then I'm going to be moving toward thinking about earthworks as a type of literary embodiment. You know, this is going to keep coming up.
Maybe do the remind me in a couple of hours if it'll drop down with the 10 minutes.
How do we do that? Oh, I see.
Do 4 hours. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Sorry about that.
So I'm going to move from thinking about earthworks as theme to thinking about earthworks as a type of structure form, and then to think about earthworks as literary embodiment or experience. And that's really a movement from sort of orthodox literary studies based in Western systems toward an indigenous literary studies that includes and hopefully centers indigenous methodologies. So I'm just going to jump right into this, and then we'll have some time for questions. And I brought lots of images because I assume people might not have ever seen earthworks on mounds from North America here. So the title of this talk is Earthworks Rising, Mound Building in Contemporary Indigenous Art, Literature, and Community. So, earthworks. This compound word evokes the obscured, eroded, desecrated, dislocated, too often destroyed, and occasionally reconstructed indigenous mounds and embankments located within North American landscapes. Moreover, the word's internal juxtaposition, earth and works, suggest a synthesis of artistry and engineering, projects and oops. Oh, it's not going to go backwards. Sorry. How do I make it go?
Previous.
There we go. Projects in applied science staged as ceremonial complex, social forum, sports or civic arena, marketplace for objects and ideas, artistic workshop, open-air theater in the round. Indigenous peoples constructed earthworks across a large expanse of the North American continent over a period of thousands of years, and several distinct kinds of mounds and embankments remain wholly or partially visible at the beginning of the 21st century, in a range of sizes and shapes, although often in altered or deteriorated conditions. These sites of worked earth suggest the multiplicity of their original functions, and they suggest the extent, purposefulness, and complexity of indigenous interactions with land and engagements with technology, sometimes singularly and within remarkably short intervals of time, but also cooperatively among diverse nations and over multiple generations. The ongoing presence of indigenous earthworks in North American landscapes, massive, well-engineered, aesthetically exquisite structures, intricately planned, mathematically and geometrically encoded, and multiply aligned with waterways, with ridges and other natural features in the landscape, and with the visible patterns of the moving cosmos above, reveals the false premises that undergird settler fantasies of virgin wilderness untouched by human hands or human minds. In what is now central and southern Ohio, where, as I mentioned, I lived for about 17 years, these structures include hundreds of large burial mounds and hundreds of large embankment walls formed into roadways, enclosures, and geometric shapes built between 2,000 and 500 years ago. Many of the burial mounds were looted in the 19th or early 20th centuries, or destroyed in the settler march toward progress. Several, however, were excavated by archaeologists and subsequently reconstructed, such as the impressive Site Mound, whose restored and manicured form measures 130 feet long by 30 feet high. Other burial mounds remain intact, although typically obscured by the growth of trees, brush, and non-native civilization. A telling representative is Jeffers Mound, sited along the Olentangy River in what was once a complex of earthworks, but is now a near suburb of the capital city of Columbus. The 20-foot-high conical mound is overgrown with weeds and trees and literally surrounded by middle-class homes, several of which regularly display U.S. flags. An isolated survivor, Jeffers is also a contemporary captive. The large geometric earthworks consist of thick embankment walls that create outlines of circles, squares, and octagons. This is kind of a computer regenerate map of earthworks at Newark. Some of the most awe-inspiring are located in the town of Newark. They include the monumental Octagon earthworks, the outline of a mathematically perfect octagon enclosing 50 acres of land connected by an embanked corridor to the outline of a circle enclosing an additional 20 acres, all of which functions as a lunar calendar, and the Great Circle Earthworks, a massive walled enclosure with a diameter measuring nearly 1,200 feet. In addition, Ohio is home to several large effigies, earth-mounded into mimetic shapes, best known as the majestic Serpent Mound, whose uncoiling form undulates for a quarter mile along the ridge above the Brush Creek Valley, its body aligned to true astronomical north, its head to the summer solstice sunset point on the horizon. There are also 6 lunar alignments in the coils of the snake as well. So one of my objectives in this work is to move beyond typical analyses of what individual earthworks and earthworks complexes might mean as examples of indigenous constructions, or why these constructions might continue to be significant for native and non-native peoples, as important as those questions are, to argue instead that earthworks might be understood not exclusively in terms of indigenous art, architecture, engineering, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, civic and ceremonial planning, spiritual systems, trade networks, and so forth. I argue that earthworks might also be understood as forms of indigenous writing, systems of signs arranged into systematic patterns, systematic encodings of knowledge through indigenous technologies and through indigenous practices and performances. Moreover, I argue that earthworks represent practices and performances not of marking or inscribing surfaces, but rather of layering rock and soil into scripts that rise above the Earth's surface. I argue that earthworks create raised scripts of platform, conical, linear, ridgetop, and perhaps especially geometric and effigy mounds. In other words, I argue that indigenous earthworks might be understood as forms of writing, not simply on the land, but literally through the medium of the land itself. So along these lines, I want to briefly explore with you some of the diverse ways contemporary Native artists, writers, intellectuals, and nations engage earthworks, and how these engagements contribute to larger arguments about the forms and power of indigenous writing, technology, and practice. In these contemporary texts, performances, and environments, encoded knowledge from the indigenous past reactivates in the present in order to rewrite indigenous futures. Part 1, Captive Earthworks Unbound. In 2007, the award-winning Choctaw filmmaker Ian Skerodin released Crazy Indian, the movie, a 20-minute stop-motion feature starring plastic action figures in alternative reality set in the then near future of 2008. In Skerodin's film, a multi-front global indigenous uprising is underway to reclaim large portions of the planet, led in what is left of the United States by the native lawyer turned guerrilla leader, Crazy Indian. The elaborate website built to support the Crazy Indian project provides relevant backstory, as well as a world map detailing where events of the uprising are happening in real time. I don't know how well you can see that, but there's a map in the background here, and this is part of the US, and then this is one of the sites that's been pulled out as an icon. One of the key icons within the map of North America is Fort Naniwaya, a reference to the mother mound of the Choctaw, located in what is now Mississippi. The Crazy Indian website describes this large platform mound as still captive to embattled US forces who have made the indigenous earthwork into a military stronghold and into a symbol of their colonial struggle for legitimacy. And this is some of the writing that's on the website that explains the importance. In Skerodin's vision of an alternative near future, it is an ancient indigenous site of spiritual, social, and political significance, the mother mound, that serves as the icon of their literal captivity, the ongoing and subjugation of their homelands. Crazy Indians' campaign to release the mother mound from her colonial captivity is simultaneously a campaign to reclaim control over the narrative of the indigenous past, including the deep past of creation, in order to move forward into a renewed indigenous future on both a local and, significantly, a global scale. Part 2, the ground beneath our feet. The work of the master potter Diego Romero from Cochiti Pueblo from Cochiti Pueblo.
Sorry, that was me.
from Coche de Pueblo in New Mexico, draws on influences from ancient Anasazi and Mimbres painted ceramics from what is now the US Southwest, but also on influences from ancient Greek pottery, contemporary marble comics, and other aspects of popular culture. The interiors of many of Romero's ceramic bowls, for instance, depict cartoon-like graphics that comment on life in a post-industrial world. Romero often creates a strong surface line in these works in order to divide graphic scenes into distinct above and below sections. Viewers see what is happening above ground and below ground at the same time. A striking example is Romero's bowl titled Mound Builders. The bowl's interior displays a band of geometric designs just below the rim and a cartoon-like graphic of active mound building in the center. These features, along with a palette of russet brown and white, allude to the influence of Mimbres pottery designs from 1,000 years ago. A clear surface line divides the graphic image roughly in half. Following Scorodin's emphasis on the captivity of the mother mound in Crazy Indian, we notice that above the surface of the earth, 3 of Romero's human figures actively construct a contemporary pyramid mound from the husks of SUVs. These large blocks of heavy metal fill space but lack vitality. Their windows appear empty and volition. Their wheels are missing. Below the surface of the earth, Romero depicts the remains of another pre-SUV world. Embedded among the rocks and soil are a classic ceramic pot and a full human skeleton. Rather than perform the archaeological narrative of ceramic shards and dismembered remains, however, Romero depicts complete pots and intact skeletons, whole cultures and whole peoples invisible to the current occupiers of the surface world, but nonetheless present in the soil beneath them. These unseen but available presences help create and then reinforce the ironic message of Romero's graphics. Romero's work resonates with the ideas expressed by the Comanche art critic and intellectual Paul Chotsmith in his essay, The Ground Beneath Our Feet. Writing about the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., Smith refocuses attention on the fact that even the National Mall is, quote, an ancient place with a history far older than the settler nation-state. Washington, Smith writes, was built on Indian debris. Everyone in the field of anthropology knew that. Archaeologists wrote a century earlier that artifacts were so numerous in this town, quote, in certain localities, they are brought in with every load of gravel from the creek beds, and the laborer constructing our streets passes them by the thousands beneath his hammer. And it is literally true that in this city, the capital of a civilized nation, is paved with the art remains of a race who occupied its site in the shadowy past, end quote. The whole of the United States, the whole of every settler nation-state occupying the Americas, is built on Indian debris, a point Romero's ceramics make through juxtapositions of contemporary graphics with ancient shapes, color combinations, and designs. In Romero's work, indigenous artifacts and skeletons maintain their wholeness below the surface. They suggest the often unknown and unacknowledged, but very real possibility of alternate presents and futures. Part 3, Electric Blue Embryo. The work of the mixed media artist Alyssa Hinton, of Tuscarora and Osage descent, continues the theme of unseen peoples and unseen worlds existing beneath or within indigenous earthworks. Her vibrant photo collage, Ancestral Plane, part of her Spiritual Ground series, depicts a burial mound constructed in the deep past and now overgrown with trees, not as the site of death, colonial nostalgia, or raw material for scholarly careers, but rather as the site of indigenous rebirth and regeneration. In her artist statement, Hinton describes the image as, quote, the cross-section of a burial mound, breaking open to reveal remnants and remains of cultural relics and people. Trees draw upon these vestiges for sustenance, while the embryo also is fed to support its new life, reawakening, rebirth. The hawk, able to see the unseeable, is the messenger of change, landing, reminding us of our potential, end quote. In Hinton's indigenous and gendered account, the burial mound is more seed than sepulcher. When conditions are appropriate, it opens of its own volition, rather than be opened by desecrated looters or archaeologists to reunite upper and lower worlds. And it is this seed, can't get it to move. And it is the seed represented in the central figure of the electric blue embryo that enables contemporary Indigenous communities to realize the power of their erased potential, perhaps to rebuild their worlds and thus to rebuild their lives anew. Hinton's coding of the hidden embryo as blue is suggestive of the idea of a code blue medical emergency, when a patient requires resuscitation because of respiratory or cardiac arrest. But the blue coding also links Hinton's arresting depiction to the vibrant work of Anishinaabe writer and intellectual Gerald Visner, who evokes the idea of an indigenous blue radiance or blue power of creation. In Visner's works, native survivance, survival understood as active creative presence, is often coded blue, or more evocatively, as blue transmotion. As Hinton makes clear in Ancestral Plane, earthworks are one category of creations through which humans actively related to each other, to animals and the environment, to the spirit world. What the dominant culture codes as red and dead, Hinton and Visner code as blue and multiply creative. Part 4, seasonal time. The idea of earthworks inspiring Indigenous world building similarly animates the 2001 novel Shell Shaker, by Choctaw writer and intellectual Leanne Howe. Howe's narrative moves back and forth between the complexities of 18th century Choctaw history in the southeastern homelands of what is now Mississippi, and the complexities of Choctaw life in the 1990s in what is now southeastern Oklahoma, where the Choctaw were removed in the 1830s. Both temporal frames, however, are set against a backdrop of even older Indigenous histories centered on earthworks, which are themselves centered around the generative Naniwaya, the Choctaw Mother Mound. In Howe's text, similar to Hinton's, earthworks remain relevant to the present. In fact, they are essential to enabling contemporary Choctaw to take care of old business, to reunite their Mississippi and Oklahoma communities divided by colonial dislocation, and to build their indigenous world anew. In a remarkable scene, mud from the Mother Mound in Mississippi bubbles up from a bowl of bread dough in a kitchen in Oklahoma, a sign from the ancestors that signals Choctaw women that the time has come to once again call the community to action. The scene where the bread dough becomes bubbling earth from the Mother Mound is situated in chapter 10 of the 17-chapter novel. That is, in the chapter that immediately follows the novel's hinge at chapter 9, where 8 chapters are balanced before and 8 chapters balanced after. Chapter 10, the first chapter of the novel's second half, is set in the present of September 24th, 1991, 2 days past the autumnal equinox, the novel's central marker of seasonal time, which Howe translates from the Choctaw Italoichi as the time to make things even. The equinox is the appropriate time to restore balance. Moving past the equinox means moving into the next seasonal cycle. Space breaks divide chapter 10 into 12 sections, which help demarcate the chapter's movements among the present conflicts of 1991, the character Aunt Dolores's multiple memories of moments in the historical past, and her vision of multiple points in the even more distant past. Aunt Dolores's vision of the distant Choctaw past occurs in the 7th section. Situated just past the chapter's center, just past its own hinge and marker of even, the beginning of the next cycle, echoing and aligning with the positioning of chapter 10 within the larger novel. The process of Aunt Dolores's central vision begins when she has finished kneading and it is time to shape her dough into rolls. A spirit voice speaks to Aunt Dolores in Choctaw, telling her that it's time to return to her homeland. The bowl of dough becomes hot in her hands, glows, quote, reds, which are further described by their distinctive clothing and technologies, suggesting they represent distant and ancient generations. Next, the grandparents of tribes arrive to offer their help too, and their generations move through other technologies. Together, these multiple generations from the distant past to the present open Mother Earth's beautiful body. In response, quote, Mother Earth turns herself inside out and a gigantic platform mound emerges out of the ground, end quote. Aunt Dolores thus witnesses the creation of the Naniwaya as a collaborative project, the multi-generational human community and the earth itself working together to produce, quote, a sacred ovulation, a gift for the future. When Aunt Dolores returns from her vision to the contemporary kitchen, the dough rising in her bowl has literally turned to mud, physically linking the generations of Choctaw women in Oklahoma to the Mother Mound in Mississippi. The risen dough, become mud, continues to bubble from the bowl, a generative source of the earth's and the people's collective power. Within the larger plot of the novel, the scene is significant for how it propels the characters toward multiple resolutions. But the scene is significant as well for how it articulates indigenous understandings of the complex technological, spiritual, and symbolic power of earthworks, and how it makes of these understandings not dead artifacts to be displayed in museums, but rather living, active entities for the present and future. Part 5, Alignment. In her 2006 sequence of poems, Blood Run, Alyssa Hinton, a poet, activist, and intellectual of Cherokee, Huron, and Creek descent, animates what was once a massive earthworks city and trade center located on both sides of the Big Sioux River on what is now the South Dakota-Iowa border. Like other earthworks, the nearly 400 at Blood Run were built to serve multiple civic, social, and sacred functions, and they were built to align with natural features in the landscape, with each other, and with significant patterns and movements in the sky. Their most surprising feature may be that, similar to earthworks in Ohio, Mississippi, and across the continent, their designs and alignments are based not only in precise observations of the natural world and cosmos, but also in complex symbolic languages, including sophisticated mathematics. On the surface, Blood Run gives voice to indigenous mound-building cultures, and most notably to the earthworks themselves. In the main body of her sequence of 66 poems, Hedgecote creates a series of 64 persona poems written from a particular voice, through which 37 distinct elements associated with the Blood Run site and its long history are enabled to speak. These include the collective voice of the mounds, as well as the individual voices of ceremonial mound, burial mound, and snake mound. The poems are organized into 4 numbered sections that suggest a temporal movement from a utopian distant past to a disrupted near past and volatile present, to an anticipation of further danger. The unnumbered epilogue then points toward the still unknown future. Across these sections, the individual persona poems work together as an activist play, a linked series of speeches and conversations spoken from multiple perspectives. Through these monologues and dialogues, Hedgecote prompts readers to reimagine Blood Run as carrying intrinsic as well as historical value, as deserving to be recognized as sacred and preserved for future generations. At the structural level, Blood Run simulates techniques for constructing actual earthworks by layering diverse forms and materials. But it also simulates the multiple physical and symbolic alignments of earthworks by repeating a set of standard units of measure, the natural numbers 4, 3, 7, and multiples of these, as well as the sequence of primes, those natural numbers that can be divided only by themselves and the number 1. Similar to Howe's subtle numerical positioning of Aunt Dolores' vision in Shell Shaker, Hedgecote's embedded numerical alignments manifest in the precise positioning of individual poems within numbered sections and within the Blood Run sequence as a whole. Moreover, they manifest in her precise numbering of lines, in her precise patterning of stanzas per poem, lines per stanza, words per line, even syllables per word, and crucially, in how these multiple numerical configurations then align further with specific content, with wordplay, allusion, and imagery, with building themes. The multi-layered textural world Hedgecote constructs in Blood Run, like the seasonal time Howe evokes in Shell Shaker, thus illustrates what Tewa scholar Gregory Kahete describes as the proper role of mathematics within indigenous scientific systems. As in physics, a field often engaged with phenomena that cannot be explained in words, Kahete argues that within indigenous fields of science, mathematics helps render transparent certain basic relationships, patterns, and cycles in the world through their quantification and symbolic coding. To take but one brief example, The seventh and final poem, written from the perspective of the collective persona of the mounds, is positioned as the seventh poem in the fourth section, emphasizing two of the sequence's basic units of measure, 4 and 7. I should point out too, 4 and 7 are often sacred numbers in American Indian traditions. The poem consists of 27 lines, divided into 9 stanzas, emphasizing and intensifying the sequence's other basic unit of measure, 3, through its cubing and squaring. The poem is further divided into 13 statements. 13 is the 6th prime. These mathematic encodings help create meaning at the structural level of the poem, and they create multiple alignments with other poems in the sequence. As the final rendering of the collective voice of the mounds at Blood Run, the poem summarizes the mound's primary functions, asserting in the opening lines, civic, ceremonial, elegant effigy, snake, our purposes, funerary, fundamental, immaculate. And then, toward the end of the poem, in the penultimate stanza, we were meant to make matters meaningful. In between, at line 14 in the 5th stanza, at the poem's fulcrum, where 13 lines and 4 stanzas are balanced above, and 13 lines and 4 stanzas are balanced below, the mounds assert the literal rebirth and regeneration of their indigenous makers. All will know our great wombed hollows. The specific idea of burial mounds functioning as wombs and seeds, and the broad theme of ancient earthworks spurring indigenous regeneration in the present and future are developed across the sequence as a whole. So this final voicing of the mounds serves as a culmination. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Hedgecote further positions the poem so that it is an immediate conversation with the fourth and final voicing of the abstract persona, memory. Together, the 37 personas of Blood Run draw attention to what outsiders have described as inanimate objects and revivify these as living, articulate entities. Sequenced to evoke multiple contexts and connections, their voices bear witness to the site's former glory, ongoing violation, and possible renewal. The mounds in particular assert that their bodies of packed earth help situate human beings within a matrix of relationships with each other, with natural forces of the universe, with the spirit world, that produce significant meaning. These assertions narrate an evolving story about place identity and sacred geography. Understood as extensions of the mathematic coding at the structural foundation of Hedgecote's poetic sequence, these assertions develop as well a highly nuanced definition of what it means for human communities to legitimately settle, not simply to occupy particular places or to exploit their resources, but to become integral to the regularities and harmonies of their dynamic systems. Part 6, environment. The beautiful 109-acre campus at the Chickasaw Cultural Center, which opened in 2010 near Sulphur, Oklahoma, boasts state-of-the-art historical and cultural exhibits, a research center and archive, a high-tech theater, an art gallery, indoor and outdoor performance spaces, gardens, 2 gift shops, and a cafe, as well as a large staff of Chickasaw citizens who serve as friendly, knowledgeable interpreters of Chickasaw history and culture. In addition, the nation has reconstructed a Chickasaw and Choka, or traditional village, a southeastern Chickasaw village surrounded by a wood stockade. The site can be viewed aerially from a height of 3 stories, standing at the Sky Pavilion, or visitors can walk down into the village to explore a large council house, examples of summer and winter family houses, a corn crib, and a stickball court. The village's most impressive structure, but perhaps also its most subtle, is a full-scale earthwork. A reconstruction of a ceremonial platform mound. And you can see it here, a mound in the back here, behind the arbor. The campus as a whole has been designed to enable immersive experiences. Exhibits encourage visitors to handle objects, practice Chickasaw vocabulary, listen to oral storytelling, or contemplate the veracity of different forms of historical evidence. Visitors are guided along the difficult path of the 1830s removal to Oklahoma, then invited to participate in the renewing counterclockwise movement of the stomp dance. At the cafe, visitors can taste bashofa, corn soup, and highly prized grape dumplings, which are delicious. At the Chickasaw and Choka, they can enter and explore houses, try their hand at stickball and other games, walk the circumference of an actual mound, and ascend its gentle slopes to experience views of the village and surrounding landscape from its height. Contemporary earthwork is but one component within a broader assertion of political, cultural, artistic, and intellectual sovereignty. The Chickasaw Nation is actively asserting control over how its history is told, from the deep past to the present and forward into the future. To build an earthwork is literally to reshape the earth to align with surrounding waterways, with other natural features in the landscape, with the sky world above. But to build an earthwork is also to reshape the earth to align with the symbolic systems that undergird, express, and shape living cultures. As forms of spatialized knowledge, as forms of indigenous writing, earthworks intersect traditions of place naming and place mapping, intersect traditions of rhythmic sound and choreographed movement, intersect traditions of visual and tactile encoding, intersect traditions of drawn and incised marks on multiple surfaces. They serve as evocative mnemonics that help transfer communal memory across time. At the Chickasaw Cultural Center, signage posted in the main exhibit hall at the Sky Pavilion overlooking the Chickasaw and Choka, and it points along the periphery of the reconstructed platform mound, inform native and non-native visitors alike that while earthworks are part of very old southeastern cultures, they're also part of living vocabularies and worldviews. Descendants of the southeastern mound-building peoples removed to Oklahoma are actively relearning what it means to live in the embodied presence of earthworks. This is perhaps especially true for the Chickasaw employees of the Cultural Center, who experience daily contact with their newly constructed mound and who work to explain its traditional functions and its contemporary significance to outside visitors, as well as to themselves. The effects of this cohabitation are not simply physical, but emotional, intellectual, spiritual. Potentially all aspects of their lives are being realigned by the active presence of indigenous mounds. Part 7, embodiment. Most of the scholarly energy focused on earthworks has been devoted to understanding their construction and specific sightings. How were they built? And why were they built in certain ways, at certain times, at certain locations? Far less scholarship has been devoted to understanding or imagining the effects of earthworks on people. Those who lived among them permanently or seasonally, those who visited earthworks for trade or special events, those who embarked on sacred pilgrimage to burial sites or to potent effigies, perhaps once in a lifetime. What did it mean to live, work, and play, to celebrate and to mourn in the presence of earthworks? What did it mean to gather at these sites for ceremony or debate, for astronomical observation, for sporting events and games, for the securing of marriages and other forms of social and political alliance, for artistic and intellectual exchange? What might it mean today or in the future? Actress and playwright Monique Mojica, who is of Kuna and Rappahannock descent, and Choctaw writer Leanne Howe, the author of Shell Shaker, are currently co-developing a new stage play that grounds its dramaturgy in the materiality and multiple functions of indigenous earthworks. Central to the development process thus far has been an extensive mound crawl, it's kind of like a pub crawl, of significant earthworks from Louisiana to Ontario. At each site they visit, the playwrights engage in what Mojica calls an indigenous artistic research methodology, a methodology, quote, that speaks to the embodiment of place. In 2011 and 2013, Native colleagues and I assisted Mojica and Howe in visiting several sites in central and southern Ohio, including the well-known Newark Earthworks, Sight Mound, Jeffers Mound, and Serpent Mound, as well as the relatively unknown Holder Wright Earthworks located just north of Columbus. This site had been a farm for about last 150 years, and so had not been available to the public, and had been repeatedly plowed and mostly destroyed. But the family decided to give the land to the city there and turn it into a park. So that's how we got access for the first time a couple of years ago. As part of a settler farm, this site was repeatedly plowed so that its large rectangular enclosure and the conical mounded enclosed are now only barely visible. While visiting Holder Right, as at other sites, Mohican and Howe enacted their methodology of embodied research, spending significant time with earthworks, walking their contours, making physical contact, engaging the senses to listen and feel for songs and story. They felt a distinctly female energy emanating from the rectangular enclosure and its mound, and they were able to pull a song up out of the site that they will incorporate into their play. In the image on screen, Mohican and Howe record themselves singing as the song comes up to them from the ground. It was a remarkable moment of Indigenous research and performance, as well as Indigenous research as performance. As this image suggests, Mohican and Howe's methodology involves an embodied improvisation, actively connecting one's physical body to earthworks as sign systems by imagining one's way into the lives that have been lived at the mounds. At another site, the large effigy known as Alligator Mound, Mohican and Howe walked the contours of the mounded animal form, which looks nothing like an alligator, made physical contact with its body, and contemplated its location. Positioned on the highest point in the landscape, the effigy offers a panoramic view of the valley. It is surrounded by a stream running along the base of the hill. The effigy's body appears arched as if caught in motion or preparing to spring into action, and it faces west, away from the major geometric earthworks at Newark. Mohican and Howe intuited that the figure is not an alligator, but a cat, perhaps a version of the underwater panther that is often also a sky panther, which circulates under and below. They imagine this feline figure as a protector for the region, as well as an emblem for the cyclical relationships among upper, middle, and lower worlds, sky, earth, and water. And they suspected that the appendage linked to the animal's midsection is a womb, marking her as female and productive. Finally, the researchers were heartened by a distinct sense that this female protector formed from mounded earth was still breathing. In her published essay about these processes, titled In Plain Sight, Inscripted Earth and Invisible Realities, Mohican asserts, the land is our archive. And in an abstract for the new play, Mohican and Howe assert together, we are mound building with our theater. The challenge, as demonstrated by Mohican, Howe, Hedgecock, and other Indigenous writers, artists, and researchers, is to relearn how to access the Indigenous knowledge and code it in the land all around us, written through Indigenous technologies and practices, waiting to be reactivated in the present and for the future. Part 8, and this is the final section, Reactivating Earthworks. Our efforts to understand ancient earthworks from Indigenous perspectives are still very much in their infancy. Standard archaeological and historical narratives, written primarily by non-native researchers, continue to dominate and dehumanize these Indigenous achievements in construction and design. But despite persistent impediments, we find ourselves in a period of extraordinary possibility. Earthworks seem suddenly to be on everybody's Indigenous mind. Artists, writers and scholars, intellectuals and activists, communities and nations. Among many Native individuals and communities, earthworks are still recognized as encoded knowledge written through the medium of the land itself, and they are still understood as gifts from the ancestors meant to be accessed and reactivated by their descendants when needed. That time appears to be now. Thank you. Destroyed the building of cities and roads. The ones that are preserved, sometimes it's through historical accident or often through colonial acts. So I was mentioning earlier the great Octagon earthworks, which is just a stunning site, and it's even hard to conceive from pictures or maps because it's so big. There's a golf course on it right now. And even though the Ohio Historical Society owns the land, they've leased it to a country club, and it's called the Mound Builders Country Club, since 1910. And they've been playing golf there since 1911. And they renewed the lease. It's one of these really long leases where they don't spend any money. They get total control. So it goes to 2078. And so activist group formed to try to force them off, and we've been trying to get UNESCO World Heritage Site status for the site. It's a very long process working with the UN. It's been about a 10-year process, although we're like number 2 on the list because it's such a significant site. But the people who run the country club are really terrible people, and they only allow 4 days a year for public access to the site. Otherwise, you have to just stand on the side. You can't get out on the site. And I had a big conference when I was at Ohio State back in 2011 to mark an important event that had happened in 1911, which was also when the golf course started. And 1911 was also the year of the first American Indian rights organization formed by Native peoples. The Society of American Indians held their first meeting in 1911, and they happened to have their meeting on the campus of Ohio State University. So in 2011, I wanted to do a centennial moment. And we knew that in 1911 they had gone to visit some of the earthworks. And so I was going to take a busload of Native scholars and visitors out to the earthworks. So I applied a year and a half in advance to the Octagon, to the country club. Could I have one of the 4 days? And they said absolutely no. They would not let me do it. So I threatened them with everything. I said, I'm going to bring a busload of Native scholars, I'm bringing the president of the university, I'm going to bring the mayor. And anyway, I was kind of bluffing. I didn't know what I was going to do. And their concession was they gave me 1 hour. I was able to bring people out, but I had to be off the site by 9 a.m. So I had to get all these people up on a Sunday morning at 7 o'clock, put them on a bus, out to Newark. But it was an amazing moment. We got to have it all to ourselves, and it's a very moving experience to be out on the site because of the scale, and when you realize the kind of alignments and its relationships to the landscape. But it's amazing that they're hiding in plain sight. The Great Circle, too, the reason it's a state park, at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was used as kind of a fairgrounds. At one point, there was a racetrack around it. There were like rides and stuff inside. There was a hotel next to it. So you have these kind of really important indigenous spaces that have been used for all kinds of profane reasons. Others were preserved because they were like military encampments. It was a big site in southern Ohio near Chillicothe, and it was Fort Sherman in World War I. And they just rebuilt the barracks and stuff on top of the earthworks, and they did a lot of destruction, but it's been reconstructed. And then other sites have just been destroyed. So yeah, so it's amazing that they're there, but they're also hard to see at the same time. Yeah?
Thank you very much, this is fascinating. The mounds, can you suggest, are also marks of presence and ownership of the land?
Oh, absolutely.
And there is this trend of rectificatory justice global, in global sense, to actually dare and reverse colonial, occupation. So I'm thinking there is this possible reality in which all the colonies across the world will unite and reclaim, and these mounds will be the marks of what belongs to whom and how it needs to be given back.
Well, it's interesting. Because some of the earthworks are so old, we often don't know exactly who built them. We think we know who their descendants might be. And it's interesting, there are very different kinds of sites. So I showed you the image, the map of like Cahokia. Cahokia was a major city. We think 20,000 people lived there about 1,000 years ago, right on the banks of the Mississippi River. And it really would have been a bounded area, clear ownership. Whereas like the sites in Ohio, where the Octagon and the circle, there was also a square and an ellipse, were never permanent occupation sites. The archaeological evidence and the stories we have would suggest that they were places that people came from all over, and that they were sites of common usage. And the archaeological evidence is that materials from all over the rest of the continent end up in Ohio. So I have to imagine people bringing massive amounts of materials from other parts. It's one of the ways we know it was a gathering place. So when they've done some excavations, so here we are in central Ohio, there's huge stash of mica from North Carolina, meteoric iron from Canada, pipestone from Minnesota, a certain kind of flint that's only from Wyoming, obsidian from the Southwest, huge marine shells and shark's teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, all coming to this one place. So people are bringing stuff from all over. It's interesting, Ohio sits on a large vein of flint. It's a very particular kind of flint that's to Ohio, and it's very beautiful when it's polished. And small pieces of that flint show up all over the continent. So it looks like people were coming and then leaving again, and maybe taking a token or sign of having been to this special place. So one of the things that's fascinating about it is that there's not just one kind of earthworks site. Part of us is, for us, is to relearn the diversity, to understand that there would have been city sites. Blood Run was a trading place. That was a place where people moved in and out. There would have been there were permanent populations there, but there were people coming. It's like a major thoroughfare along the rivers there. And part of our challenge is to relearn that the rivers are like superhighways. They're how people move. So sometimes our old archaeology will tell us small, isolated societies, static, never moving, when instead what you see when you look at a map and you look at just where all the riverways are, Mississippi River right down the middle is a huge highway. The Ohio River goes this way. You can go up the Olentangy, up the Scioto to the Olentangy. You can get to Newark really easily by water. If you just looked at a map of the land, you would think, oh, it's really remote. But if you look at the riverways, and you understand all the earthworks are sited along water, you think, oh, you can move. Now, if people are going by watercraft, they can move quite quickly. Same is true in the southeast. There's all those riverways. So we have to imagine not just one group necessarily owning a place forever, but people having relationships to land. And so it's quite complex. Down in Louisiana, that I showed you the map of like Poverty Point. It's another massive site. It's just huge. And it's one of the older sites. The dating is to at least 8,000 years ago. And there, what they found are places where it looks like there's experimental mounds. Like people were learning how to build earthworks and figuring out the engineering so that they would last over time. Because it's incredible that the engineering has been so good that these sites have not eroded away and washed away with water. So yes, marking territory, but it's also interesting the kind of it also marks connections. We think there were roadways, there were all kinds of uses of earthworks for marking territory and connecting people.
So if there was this action, well, globally or wherever, and land was given back, would that be a problem?
You know, it's something we've talked about quite a bit. People are interested in this, about what would Indigenous stewardship of these sites look like. And I think that's the word at least a lot of people are using now, is thinking about stewardship, thinking about how do we care for the sites in a way that's respectful to the ancestors and meaningful to contemporary populations. And I think it would really vary, that it would depend on where you were. Some sites would be very clearly belong to certain peoples. Like in the southeast, Chickasaw sites, Choctaw sites, Creek sites would be relatively easy to demarcate. But in places like Ohio, you would have people from all over sort of making claims. And it might make the most sense to think of it as a kind of commons, as a place where many nations. One of the things I've gotten very excited about in thinking about earthworks as writing is to think about the way that there's sign systems that can be interpreted from multiple perspectives. So basic circle, square, octagon, snake, that different groups could have had their different meanings attached to the same symbols. And we know this is true from like basket weaving, where you can have in the Pacific Northwest in the US, valley to valley, people using the same design motifs, very different meanings, based on their local knowledge and local customs, but the same basic shapes being used, right? Same geometric shapes that work in weaving patterns. I've been trying to imagine the earthworks as also a kind of readable landscape that people from very different places could have understood, but they might have had not the exact same meanings, they might have had related meanings. Some indigenous groups from the Great Lakes region, from sort of north, who aren't really necessarily known for having mound building traditions, are kind of saying, well, actually, all those symbols make sense to us, and our ancestors used them, right, as well. I think over time, as this research continues, we're going to have lots of new kind of theories about just how complex the usage was. I think one of the, and this, I know this will make sense to you all here in Australia as well, that often what we have to work against is the old archaeology and the old anthropology, because the kind of paradigms that we're given are very limited. So a lot of times it's either, it's only a sacred site, or it's only for warfare. That's often what happens in the US context. It's either a fort, and a lot of them get called forts. There's a big site in Ohio called Fort Ancient, because it's on a hilltop and it has a wall all the way around it. But it's clearly not a fort because the wall is only like this big. They're not really keeping out anybody. But it's clear that the site does other kinds of work. And the excavations there have been amazing, that they think that there's storytelling built into the structure. So they didn't just take any kind of dirt and soil. It's very particular which kinds of soil are used at different levels of building the earthworks. And in Fort Ancient and some other sites, at a particular level, there's the soil that comes only from underneath water, so under like in a pond. So you know at the bottom of a pond you have that mucky soil that's always wet because it's been super saturated? That kind of soil shows up at a very particular layer of all the walls. And so one idea is that it's embedding in the building of the structure itself the story of the earth diver. So there's a major myth, sort of story system across North America, often called the earth diver story. And basically the idea is there was a flood covering everything, all water, and then often it's a woman who falls from the sky, sometimes called Sky Woman. And when she falls from the sky, it's water, she lands on the back of the turtle. And so sometimes you may have heard of North America referred to as Turtle Island. It comes from this story. So Sky Woman falls, the turtle kind of rescues her, she's there, there's no land. And so she's looking for land, and so she asks all the animals to help her. And they think that there might be some land at the bottom of the water. So different animals dive into the water to try to bring back Earth. And in different versions of the story, a different animal is successful. So sometimes it's muskrat, sometimes it's duck, the Chickasaw it's crayfish, different peoples it's a different animal. But one animal finally goes all the way down, brings back one little grain of mud, puts it on turtle's back, and then it grows and becomes North America. And so one idea is that that layer of that mud from the bottom of the water is retelling that story. We also think that some of the conical mounds that were built on the floodplains of rivers may have been a kind of model for the story as well. So that when the rivers flooded, it would cover the earthwork, and then when the waters receded, it would be like you saw the earth diver myth happening. Because it would start at one little point and then it would get bigger and bigger and bigger, like the back of a turtle. But it's fascinating. At Poverty Point, too, there's a big bird effigy. And archaeologists have confirmed it only took 3 months to build. All the old theories are that these things took hundreds of years to build and forever. And the dating, they figured out it was built in 3 months. And Leanne Howe, who I was talking about, has a theory that it's a story mound, that it tells the story of the red-tailed hawk, which is an important animal for southeastern peoples, and that they would have built it during the gestation period. So from laying the egg to the hatchling leaving the nest is a 3-month period. And so her speculation is that they were building the story of the red hawk's creation into the earthwork. That's right. We don't know for sure lots of this. It's a lot of speculative theories about what was happening. Yeah.
Apart from the Ohio one where you mentioned it's got elements from all over, are the mounds generally made from materials close by?
Yes. So there will be often pits, borrow pits, close by where the earth was taken. So those other materials show up in like the burial mounds, but they're not usually part of the construction of the mound itself.
And you, like, how far north and south do the sort of mounds?
So they go the whole range, pretty much, not up into the Arctic, but they go from Louisiana, which is in the deep south,
Yeah.
all the way up to Ontario,
Right.
so into southern Canada.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, like there are at least 2 known snake effigies up in Canada. There's one at Rice Lake in Ontario. There's actually one in what's now downtown Toronto. But it's been largely destroyed. There's a park in Toronto. If you know where to look, it's still partially visible. And some elders we've talked to sort of think, that all these serpents are related. There was also a snake at Blood Run, and they represent a kind of underwater snake in the rivers, and sort of linking those sites. It's interesting to think about, though, across such a large expanse. Again, it really gives the lie to the kind of theories of isolated people, right? Living these very kind of circumscribed lives, and instead you have to reimagine communication, movement, trade over really large distances, right?
Well, is there any conception of like the idea of earthworks relating to peoples in South America or over in Asia? Like, is there sort of like even beyond the North American?
Sure. Well, there's lots of speculation. Old archaeology, of course, would say no, there's no connection, that people were really cut off from South America. But it doesn't make any sense. I think the more research that's done, we're going to find more and more. Of course, there was trade and movement up and down the Americas. I had the opportunity, I went to Belize and Guatemala a few years ago and went to some of the Mayan sites. I went to Tikal, which is the big site in Guatemala where the big jaguar temple is, and the beautiful plaza and the pyramids. So they're building on stone, but they're using very similar principles. And it was built about the same time as the NIRAKN earthworks. And it was fascinating standing there and realizing everything's mathematically encoded, everything's aligned to the 4 directions, right? Everything is highly symbolic while also highly functional. And it's all, you realize it does appear that there are these relationships up and down. We don't necessarily have the evidence to confirm at this point. But I was telling some people earlier, we know there was movement in other things. We know that corn gets domesticated in South America and moves all the way up to Canada. And over time diversifies for different environments. And with corn goes the story of corn. And the story of corn is very similar, where corn comes from, the corn woman story. Whether you're talking South America or up into, say, like northeast of the United States, you have similar types of story. And so that also suggests trade, movement, right? I don't know about links to other parts of the world, and you know, those are highly speculative ideas about how much movement was there across, you know, the planet. You know, there's lots of interesting new work suggesting, you know, that Polynesians probably got to South America, or South Americans got to the islands. Kumara, the sweet potato, comes from Latin America, ends up in New Zealand and other places, and the chicken that's in South America is the Polynesian chicken. So at some point, something happened. We don't know exactly what. It is interesting, though, that mound building happens in other parts of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it is a kind of global phenomenon. And a lot of people don't realize this either. There are earthworks in Korea, there are earthworks in Ireland, there are earthworks other parts, and it depends on what you count. But you know, Polynesians also, you know, they do terracing, you build trenches, there are all kinds of manipulating, right, the earth. And people have been doing this all over the planet for a really long time. Whether or not they have contact is a different question. But it's certainly something, a very human activity. And this recognition sort of helps us understand and relate, you know, different kinds of peoples. And earthworks are used in similar but also in really distinctive ways, I think, in different parts of the planet. I was most surprised when I heard that there were earthworks in Korea, and one of my colleagues went and got to see them, so it was really fascinating. But of course, that's part of the colonial narrative. We forget there are indigenous peoples in Asia as well. And we typically tell a different narrative. But I've been very interested in the fact that it's artists and writers who seem to be out in front of this, instead of other kinds of researchers. And people like Alison Hedgecock and Leanne Howe have really done some sort of remarkable work at reclaiming ways of understanding the earthworks that got out ahead of anthropologists and historians.
Yeah, that was, I had a number of questions, but I think they're all related. But one was that doesn't seem to be a large legacy from that early anthropological, archaeological effort, as there might have been, say, here in Australia, to the extent that you know, part of the effort in Australia is to try and get materials back
Yes.
that were appropriated.
Right.
But then there's the impact then of the analysis and the ethnocentricity of that analysis.
Right.
So I would have, here nowadays, you're heavily reliant on archaeologists and anthropologists to actually do a lot of things, particularly in the context of native title and protecting
Right.
heritage sites.
And that's true in the US as well. I just haven't, not focusing on that part of it. There's a huge archaeological literature, huge anthropological literature.
What's the early historical council, you know, with first contact? What do they say? Is there any mention of that in text?
Of the earthworks? Yeah, from very early on, people were aware, Europeans and the Americans saw, they didn't know what to think about them though. And in like the colonial period, you know, Thomas Jefferson was very interested in various, sending people out to find out information, like Lewis Clark, so there's lots of information about earthworks. Into the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, there are lots of crazy theories because, and this won't surprise you, but people were very interested in somehow disconnecting these amazing structures, earthworks, from contemporary Native people.
Same with Australia.
Same with here, right? So you wanted to say, this amazing stuff, like Cahokia and Ohio and stuff, could not have been built by these savages here. So they came up with all these theories. So there were theories that like the Vikings had built them, they'd come over, come inland, stayed long enough, built all these things, or Phoenicians, or people. There was a crazy theory about there was a race of white giants who lived in North America, and that contemporary Native people had killed them. Yeah, exactly. But you get all of this sort of contortions, right, to figure out how do we come up with a narrative so it's not Native people. The Mormon Church, you know, the idea of Joseph Smith finding the tablets in a cave, he finds the tablets in an earthwork site, in a mountain site, and the Mormons have a whole theory about, well, North America in general, but they have a theory about the earthworks. And when I was living in Ohio, I mean, every summer the Mormon Church brings busloads of people to see the earthworks, and they tell a very different version of how they fit into their cosmology and their history. So lots of attempts to figure out ways to divorce them from contemporary Native people.
But it does that, but it also then erases all other systems of thought and logic.
Right.
So I was interested, the second part of what I was interested in was the quantitative work.
The mathematics and
Trying to
geometry
communicate something.
is just amazing. It's interesting that it's contemporary technology, so it's called LiDAR. You fly over a site and basically it shoots photons of light down, and everywhere it hits, it takes a measurement. So it gets these really amazing topographical maps. And it was developed by the military to use for bombing, of course, but it's been put to other uses for like measuring erosion and looking at sites. But even sites that are really measurement, and it's double, and then the hypotenuse shows up as well. I mean, and figured out that even though the old archaeology was like there are 3 distinct cultures in Ohio over this long period of time, doing very different things, this suggests it's one culture evolving over time, and they're using the math and geometry, and they're kind of playing with it. So they figured out that like big circle over here has the exact same area as the square over here. It's called squaring the circle, and it's not an easy geometric thing. So you're learning geometry in school, this is a hard thing to learn to do, is how do you make a square and a circle have the exact same area. So it's something they figured out, and then they were kind of playing with, or the circle here will fit inside the circle over here. Or like at the Octagon and the circle in Newark are exactly 6 diameters apart. Okay? And so they're playing with the units of measurement and kind of encoding the whole space. And then you have all these walkways and roadways that really kind of guide you in and out where you can go. It's fascinating to think about, like, you know, any society, how the way you build your environment then affects movement, right, understanding of space and what different places where people are allowed to go or not supposed to go, and trying to reimagine that. So all of that's in play, and then you think about alignment with the stars, the sun, and the moon. So you've got that astronomy as well as the mathematics and the geometry happening at the same time. Yeah, Alyssa Hinton, the poet, again, I gave you the poems, wanted you just to see. She's just brilliant. She's just brilliant. And she doesn't announce anywhere in the book that she's done this. And I had actually been teaching the book for a couple of years before I kind of figured out what was going on. And it was only when I went to a lecture by the archaeologist who's done all this work on LiDAR, and he was showing all the math at the sites, and he had it like on a computer screen and was showing how the math works and how the different earthworks fit inside each other and how they're related. And I was watching this lecture and I went, I think that's what she's doing. She's doing something with earthworks kind of principles of alignment. And then I got really obsessed for many, many weeks and sat down and counted everything in the book and sort of mapped out, I made a map of sort of the blood run sequence. And sure enough, we're sort of all this recurrence, all this stuff sort of showing up, and we end up these really interesting relationships.
Yeah, that's what I was interested in, the use of the quantitative to actually demonstrate and explain complex relationships between different things. Because quite often, part of that colonial effort is that we don't have a science or a maths.
Exactly, exactly. And that's often used, right, as the basic dividing line between who's civilized and who's not civilized, is do you have some form of science?
Or books or fences, yeah.
Exactly, or some form of writing. And that's one of the reasons I've been really wanting to emphasize and try to make the argument that earthworks are a type of writing, because it's often used as the, when do you enter history? You enter history when you have writing. And so if we look at encoding, multiple kinds of encoding, as a type of writing, then we can talk about, well, indigenous peoples have writing going all the way back, and in multiple kinds of writing, right? So whether it's the inscribing in the surface, or it's inscribing in the body, or it's using knotting and different kinds of, like in South America, the quipu, or things like belts of wampum, which is a digital encoding system using purple and white shells. Totally readable if you're initiated into the system. It's a readable, right, text, right? Which is amazing looking at the art here, this readable text, right? And learning how to be initiated, and sort of imagining that earthworks might function that way as well, that there would have been people who were really able to read those landscapes.
Yeah, it's a disregard, isn't it, for this? I mean, Indigenous cultures now, they're saying of astronomy, and they had, maps that were, they had everything that was, quite scientific, very elaborate calendars, which are now being put together, environmental calendars.
Right.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. So, yeah.
And finally kind of recognizing that
Yeah.
there's been this sort of complex systems of knowledge and recording knowledge. I think it's especially the part about that these things were actually recorded in different ways. Right?
Mm.
There are systems for keeping the knowledge and passing it through generations. And it gets us a little bit away then from the stereotypes about, well, the oral tradition, once it's gone, right, then there's one little slip and then everything's gone. Instead of imagining like the Octagon Earthworks, nobody knew it was a lunar calendar for like 1,500 years. And in the 1980s, people rediscovered, oh, it's a lunar calendar, right? And it just hadn't occurred to anybody. But the knowledge was still there, and for me, that's the lesson. If we learn how to see it, we learn how to decode it, the knowledge is often still there. We may not be able to get back everything, but there's a lot that's actually encoded in these different kinds of structures.
Yeah, it's, the question you asked is then why Indigenous cultures chose not to, what decisions they made about how to record information if they were going to use it in a material form, and why they didn't resort to paper and write things. And, there's all sorts of speculation you can make about that, but it seems to me in our oral tradition that there were people that were knowledge holders who were very specific. And I guess you could theorise that, well, in that way the knowledge is kept intact and it's kept pure.
Right.
Because it's if everyone was writing it down at the time, it starts to get confusing because you've got 5, 6, 10 different accounts of one thing.
Right.
Whereas one person can retain it and then pass it down in various ways, through dance, ceremony, other things, and instruction.
Right.
And then I was telling you about the normal way of passing knowledge and how that relates to emotional maturity and emotional intelligence. So,
people being initiated into knowledge instead of,
well, in that sort of, in a parallel way, we could have a person graduating here at age 22, 23, providing they pass a quantitative score. But you'll know they might not pass that knowledge on to themselves in their 30s.
Exactly.
And so, if you think about, well, okay, someone in their 20s is writing down information about something. What do they know at that point in their life? Compared to knowledge holder in our culture would be someone a lot older, who mastered the system, who passes it down in particular ways.
So that's part of that. I think you're absolutely right. The difference in epistemologies and understanding like how knowledge should be structured and who should have access. And And it's interesting when you try to teach stuff like this in the Western classroom, it is sometimes seen as kind of offensive, right, to some, that the idea that all knowledge isn't just available to everyone, right? That knowledge might be based on your age, your gender, your location, right, your genealogy. And, you know, it's very different system then.
It's like a patents office. There's lots of Western knowledge that's not open to everybody. We don't know how
Right.
Microsoft.
But the discourse is that Western knowledge is open to everybody, even though the reality is that we know there's lots of
secrets,
inequities and how knowledge gets used. But that fundamental difference, absolutely, in understanding how people understood what was happening in terms of passing knowledge on.
So, I like the idea of the mounts just sitting there waiting for the right time to be deactivated, reactivated. So
Yes.
it can take probably, you know, hundreds of years, but
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, the Chickasaw Cultural Center, which is just a stunning place. It's
It's amazing.
about an hour from where my parents live in Oklahoma. And it's just a
We need a
beautiful
road trip,
site.
actually.
And
We need a road
it's
trip.
so exciting to go there and see that and building. And now in Oklahoma City, they're building a new cultural center that's for 39 tribes, for all the tribes that got brought to Oklahoma. They're building earthworks there too, but they're building very contemporary, cool-looking earthworks. Creek Nation has built one of its tribal offices in the shape of an earthwork, and it's a building and then an earthwork. So suddenly it's like coming back in certain places. It'll be interesting to see. You know, as different tribal groups get money through various means, and in the US it's often through casino money, it makes things possible. And that's how the Chickasaw were able to do it. We have two big casinos, one in the county where I'm from, and then one just outside of Oklahoma City. And that money coming in, but the cultural center, they're building hospitals, they're doing businesses, they're doing all kinds of stuff. But, you know, once the resources are there, things become possible for doing things like reclaiming sites and rethinking how to use those sites and make them available to communities.
there's also something I sometimes ask myself. I'm not an Indigenous person, but my interest is colonial issues and what the different cultures of the world would have looked like if there was no colonialism and they had the resources.
Right.
So resources were not depleted and the culture would continue to develop and flourish. How they look
Right.
and how they think and how they build and all that.
Right.
So
Those are great questions, and it's always interesting to think about. You know, some of these sites appear to have been abandoned at some point, and we don't know if it was because climate change, resource, or something happened. And it's interesting to know, like, would the same sites have remained over time, or would people have moved on to a different site, built a new place, come back cyclically? We don't know because it all got interrupted, right? And it got interrupted by disease, and then it got interrupted by conquest, and it got interrupted by dislocation. You know, in the U.S. particularly, there's a lot of removal of peoples to different parts of the country. So they've got disconnected from their traditional lands. So we don't know, but the future is actually looking much more interesting. In the last few years, a lot of new stuff has been happening.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you all. I really appreciate
We've
it.
got to get to the airport soon, so I think it's a very stimulating, very interesting presentation. I'm sorry more people didn't come, but it's their loss, I think.
They've requested WebEx, lots of people.
And I'll tell you, if you haven't looked, I gave you a sample from Blood Run. You might find some of the poems interesting. And I published an article in Blood Run, and I sent it ahead, so if people are interested, you might want to read that, because the math is actually just fairly fascinating what Hedgecote was able to do.
Well, it's certainly on my list to go and see now, these mounts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, so you have good information and know where to go and how to find things. And this is part of the effort to get World Heritage Site status, is to make them more visible to the public, so that people look for good information. Because there's a lot of crazy websites that talk about aliens from outer space and all kinds of stuff. There's always those theories too, right?
Yeah, too, don't worry.
That everything's like, it's all about outer space.
Yeah, we've got that too, depicted in paintings.
Exactly.
These figures show up that help me.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.